In 1740, the death of Emperor Charles VI ignited a conflict that would reshape Europe. His daughter, Maria Theresa, inherited the Habsburg throne, but rival powers saw an opportunity to challenge her rule. What followed was nearly a decade of war, as Prussia, France, Britain and Spain fought for dominance, on battlefields stretching from Europe to the Americas and even India. It was a war of ambition, diplomacy and shifting alliances, setting the stage for future global conflicts. Join us as we dive into the War of the Austrian Succession, its causes, battles, and lasting impact on history. Designed to settle whether a French prince or Austrian archduke should inherit the empty throne in Madrid, the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht brought an end to the War of the Spanish Succession. The contract included clauses whereby the oldest son, or lacking a son, would pass immediately to the eldest daughter of Austrian Emperor Charles VI from the imperial throne in Vienna. Philippe, the young French prince who was Duke of Anjou, became King Philip V. The Austrian pretender to the Spanish throne became Emperor Charles VI. Serving as a barrier against Ottoman ambitions and Eastern intrusions, the Habsburg Austrian possessions were of great size and significance to Europe. The empire included Austria, most of southern Germany, portions of Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, the southern Netherlands, and vast stretches of the Tyrol and Italy. Austrian interests and influence permeated much of Europe. The welfare of the empire was that of all. Vienna battled to manage the large empire and lacked a strong central administration, however. Arriving in 1717, Maria Theresa Walburga Amalia Christina, firstborn child of Emperor Charles VI, caused great disturbance to Western Europe. The two daughters of Charles's dead elder brother, Joseph I, were not taken into account for the Vienna succession under the rules of the pragmatic sanction found in the Treaty of Utrecht. Maria Theresa's husband, Duke Francis Stephen of Lorraine, handed up the title and territory to France in trade for the Austrian-held Duchy of Tuscany, effectively resolving the War of the Polish Succession and earning the title of an Austrian archduke in the process. Maria Theresa was crowned Queen of Hungary in 1741. Her bravery and will gained respect in hearts. Unexpected resistance for Austrian soldiers included the assault of Munich and Bavarian land. But when the Austrian army lost the fight at Chotusitz on May 17, 1742, Frederick II agreed to a peace in Breslau, ending the hostilities. To cooperate with Hanoverian and Hessian detachments, King George II sent 16,000 British soldiers to the Austrian Netherlands in 1742. Plotting an invasion of France, occupation of Dunkirk, and assault on Paris, the British commander of the Pragmatic Army developed. But this plan was not pursued, and 1742 passed with quite little northern action. Between opposing French and Allied forces, the new year saw a lot of posturing, marching and maneuvering. King George II, his second son William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, and Duc de Noailles led the 40,000-strong Pragmatic Army. But the scheme was destroyed when de Gramont moved on open terrain without appropriate backup early on. Notwithstanding the French casualties, there was unquestionable victory mostly because of French mistakes and the last British king to actively engage in combat. 6 weeks later, France officially declared war on Great Britain and Austria, accusing Maria Theresa as Queen of Hungary, charging her with breaching the provisions of the Pragmatic Sanction, and providing support to Spain in their conflict with Britain. General George Wade had around 50,000 men under command when the Joint Army moved actively in June 1744. Great Britain sent reinforcements after a grand review close to Oudenarde on the Scheldt, therefore increasing the potential Allied strength to 64,000. Still, just 38,000 of them were British and Hanoverian soldiers, considered to be the most valuable. The Dutch army had a sizable German component, which did not suggest any unreliability. With 62,000 men, centered for the time being on the city of Lille, the French might have. While Wade maybe lacked the strength to launch a successful operation, the French had managed to find many strategic stepping-off places for a future advance deep into the Austrian Netherlands, still unproductively occupied in manning other fortifications under no actual danger, many Dutch soldiers. A hazy strategy was developed to relocate to attack Lille, but the French rapidly strengthened the garrison there and nothing came of the idea. Wade was attacked for his idleness, and he last turned over Low Country Allied army leadership to Sir John Ligonier. Particularly their alleged refusal to deploy heavy artillery, he sought to transfer the responsibility for the slow behavior of the war on Dutch stubbornness and hesitation to expend money on supplies and ordnance. Diplomatically, it appeared to fit the participants to the combined effort, including the States General, to pool their resources. Great Britain, Austria, Holland and Saxony signed an alliance on January 8, 1745, to progress the war against France and Maria Theresa's claim. Early to mid-18th century military engagements in Western Europe were constrained by intentional strategy and a need to avoid recurring tragedies of the 30 Years' War and the 9 Years' War. To stop rival armies from surviving, French army leaders used aggressive strategies that included eating up a nation, therefore depriving the civilian population of food and income. To allow their troops to function, commandants often purchased commercial labor, including drivers for supply transportation and contractors who provided merchandise. Given the bad roads of the period, maintaining a sizable army throughout campaigns was a major obstacle. By the time of Marlborough and Eugene's fight at Malplaquet in 1709, armies of twice the size and more were used. The weakness of France was Louis XIV's protracted war-related national financial depletion. In the 18th century, the infantry battalion, cavalry squadron and 4- or 6-gun/howitzer artillery battery were the fundamental elements for any army. Soldiers fought with basic weapons such as the field cannon saber carbine pistol and the smoothbore musket. For commanders at all levels, the practical instrument of formal formations was very vital. Often via sophisticated tactics or siege warfare, the French Revolution drew attention to the need for averting casualties in military operations. Many times resulting in blood loss and infection, soldiers sustained serious wounds. Though not all troops were persuaded of the value of surgeons and their aides, medical services on campaign were usually superior to civilian equivalents. The lack of agile mobility of the troops engaged and the unwillingness of commanders to risk made siege warfare a typical occurrence of campaigns in the 18th century. Both sides battled with intercepting enemy communications and supplies, which may change the course of the war. Born in Goslar, Germany in 1696 to Swedish-born Countess Maria Aurora von Königsmark and Frederick Augustus, Elector of Saxony, Arminius Maurice de Saxe was quite the notable figure. Frederick Augustus acknowledged him as Maurice, Count of Saxony, and he was instrumental in the siege and conquest of Belgrade. With his royal father's financial assistance, Saxe followed his military career thinking he could understand the business of war better in the French army than in the Saxon one. Appointed Maréchal de Camp in the army, he bought the colonelcy of the German-speaking Greder Regiment, also known as the Saxe Regiment. Frederick Augustus, King of Poland and Elector of Saxony, died in 1733, sparking the Polish succession. Stanislaus Leszczyński, Poznan's governor, was chosen by the French over his son Frederick Augustus III, who had Austria's implicit backing. Declared on October 10, 1733, war was raging in Lombardy and the Upper Rhine between French and Austrian armies. Under Marshal Berwick, Saxe was Maréchal de Camp and followed the French army in a push over strategically important crossing locations across the Rhine. Saxe's leadership of the vanguard resulted from the French and Bavarian march on Vienna, brushing past an Austrian blocking army at Ulm in 1741. Saxe took over de Broglie's troops and was assigned to lead the French army in the Palatinate in 1743. Raised to the rank of Marshal of France in 1744, he argued in favor of an aggressive expedition into the Low Countries. Louis XV named Saxe commander of the major French military army in the north in 1744. Marshal Saxe rose to prominence in May 1745 after achieving significant success in the Fontenoy surroundings. The monarch bestowed upon him honors, including a 40,000 livre yearly salary and tenancy for life of the royal Château de Chambord. Born in 1721, William Augustus Cumberland was a royal duke and colonel in the 2nd English Foot Guards. Cumberland was well read on the life and campaigns of outstanding leaders, even though he lacked actual combat experience. In 1742, he was raised to the 1st English Foot Guards and appointed Privy Councillor. Cumberland became a major general as George II got ready for his Low Country campaign. Cumberland became Captain General of all His Majesty's land forces and head of the Allied army when France declared war on Great Britain in 1744. Cumberland signed the peace preliminary agreements in 1748 after the conclusion of the war. Following peace, Cumberland concentrated on army reform, enhancing discipline, training, equipment, clothes, and pay. Still, his initiatives were controversial among many officials who objected to the rigorous restrictions put on their operations. Prince Frederick of Wales grew sick and passed away in 1751, leaving 13-year-old oldest son George alone. There came the issue of selecting a regency, and Cumberland was proposed. Hunting, horse racing, and improvements to Windsor Great Park comforted Cumberland. French aspirations and incursions in North America and southern India in 1757 resulted in the 7 Years' War, and an army of observation was established. Cumberland confronted the French at Hastenbeck in 1757 in a disorganized and piecemeal fight, but French General Chavert turned his left flank with a creative night march into uncharted, forested hill territory. Exposed to the French-provided route to Hanover, Cumberland's army withdrew along its own lines of supplies and communication towards the River Elbe. Concerned about Cumberland's health, George II sent a letter to his son George II expressing the same worries for his welfare. To safeguard Hanover, Brunswick, and Hesse-Kassel from invasion and devastation, Cumberland had been given broad authority to negotiate a ceasefire or possibly a permanent peace. King Louis XV and his son Ulrich Friedrich Waldemar, Count von Lowendahl, had a major effect on the campaign and fight of Fontenoy. Born in Hamburg to Danish parents, Lowendahl served Habsburg Emperor Charles VI at 13 years old and thereafter joined the Saxon army. In 1734 he led the Saxon army on the Rhine and defended Krakow during the War of the Polish Succession. His achievements in Flanders in 1744 guaranteed his reputation with the French and significantly helped Saxe to be successful at Fontenoy. But he fell from lack of authority over his army in 1747. Appointed to lead the Allied army in 1744, Karl August Friedrich was the Dutch commander at Fontenoy. Notwithstanding criticism, Waldeck was appointed an imperial field marshal in 1746, and remained in charge of the Dutch forces serving Maria Theresa. Agreed at Warsaw in January 1745, the Treaty of the Quadruple Alliance advanced Maria Theresa's and her husband's cause of action in the war. Following Field Marshal Koenigsegg's advice, Cumberland assumed command of the French army at The Hague on April 17, 1745, aiming to split enemy troops in Flanders, give the Dutch something to worry about, and make George II anxious about his constituency of Hanover-Saxe, sick with severe dropsy, laid forth his ideas for the war that summer. Approved by the French king, Saxe landed at Valenciennes on April 15. With his top commanders, Saxe joined the French army, thinking about numerous ways to attack Huy and Liège on the Meuse or endanger Maastricht. Aiming to eliminate Oudenarde as a supply base for the Allied war, he decided to attack farther down the river Scheldt and endanger it. Tournay's first goal was a wise one, as it would provide his force nearly complete freedom to follow the Scheldt as it ran northward. Originally concentrating on defending the fortifications guarding Holland's boundaries, the Allied camp changed its stance to become aggressive after the Duke of Cumberland was appointed Captain General and de facto army commander. By April 28, Duc d'Harcourt had paid the 7,000-strong Dutch and Swiss recruited garrison at Tournai. Despite being honest and competent men, neither Baron van Dort nor Major General van Brakel were particularly fit and in their prime. Given the feasibility of the route linking ATH and Lois into Tournai, the Duke of Marlborough's choice to try a direct assault on the French left flank in 1745 seemed dubious. The Allies' main priority was to break out of the Tournai siege as soon as feasible, and the Dutch commanders there fought valiantly in spite of their limited conditions. Led by Duke Cumberland, the French army was deceived into thinking the British intended to besiege Mons. But Cumberland was under pressure from the Dutch to respond swiftly after learning of the investment in the castle. Realizing a formal siege of Tournai had started, the Allied troops felt compelled to rescue the fortification. The Allied army was close to the French army protecting the siege by May, hence, a big conflict was unavoidable. To prepare for a general offensive, the Duke of Brussels ordered the removal of French front posts. Beginning efforts to create access via orchards and gardens near Vaison, French pioneers established their major positions on the open area around and behind Fontenoy. Saxe was permitted by the Marquis de Dreux-Brez to send 56,000 men for the forthcoming fight against Cumberland. More artillery was hauled into position to sweep the approaches and open fields. Saxe erected 3 strong earth and wood redoubts connecting the settlement with the cottages of Antoine. Arriving on May 7th, Louis XV brought an outstanding entourage along with his oldest son, the Dauphin. Deploying royal grenadiers and artillery to guard bridges at crossing sites across the Schlecht at Cologne, Marshal Saxe prepares for a possible French army withdrawal. Deployed on open land between Fontenoy-Antoine and the Bois de Barry, the remaining 33,000-strong force was led by Cumberland. The French army was unsure about their location and strength but noted a discrepancy between Fontenoy and the Bois de Barry. The sloping plain of the battlefield and narrow field of vision of the Allied army made their strategy dubious and dangerous. With 90 cannons, the Duke of Tournai sent 50,000 men, including 14,000 cavalry, along with the 1st and 2nd English Foot Guards, the 3rd, Scots Foot Guards, and the 1st, 8th, 21st, 22nd, 31st and 33rd regiments of foot comprised the British infantry. The Ligne Dragoons and the Garde Tavoy comprised the Dutch forces. Although Marshal Saxe intended to tempt Cumberland to launch his army into a well-prepared killing zone, his lack of trust in his soldiers resulted in no actual mass of maneuvering. Led by Henry VIII, the British and Hanoverian army valiantly marched against the French in spite of French artillery's crossfire. The Marshal's problems were exacerbated by a British round-shot killing Chevalier de Brocard, the Duke's chief of artillery. The Allied infantry's front line included the 1st English Foot Guards, 3rd Foot Guards, 2nd English Foot Guards, Hanoverian regiments of Sporken, Zastrow, von Borschlanger, Du Obers, and Kampen. Cumberland aimed to spin to the left and cut apart his opponent's line, then push his British and Hanoverian men into the left center of the French posture. Losing almost 400 dead and wounded, the French troops engaged the Foot Guards in a terrible fight. While the French Foot Guards were anticipated to flee at the first shot, the Gardes Françaises and Suisse sustained great fatalities. Still, order was soon restored, and Cumberland and Ligonier carried Saxe's critical left-center position. While Saxe dedicated his infantry reserves to prevent Cumberland's advance from Touraine, the French infantry suffered losses, and the British and Hanoverian soldiers suffered too. Still, the issue is whether the secondary chores, of such significance for the general success, could have been accomplished given the conditions and tools at hand. The Allied soldiers with Cumberland were positioned in a limited area between Fontenoy and the Bois de Barry at 12:30 in the afternoon. With the Royal Brigade and Guards Brigade on the right flank, the Hanoverian battalions had dropped back to create a third line. Stationed in the middle of the column directly ahead of von Zastrow's Hanoverians, the Duke and Field Marshal Koenigsegg were trying to reorganize their shattered lines. A new push started across the grassy plain toward the scattering French army. Just the first line of mounted troops went forward to attempt to hurl back the Duke and his powerful infantry column. Hence, the first French cavalry attack was fragmented and lacking in punch. An apparently unseen hand held back the French troops while the fire of the Allied army had its terrible impact. Despite suffering terrible casualties from the valiant and fruitless French offensive, both friends and enemies that day greatly valued the effort. With French first-line cavalry comprising the Royal Roussillon, Carabiniers du Roi, Prince Camille, Colonel General, and Broncos regiments, Cumberland's infantry column faced a tough struggle. Though their attempts were more frantic and poorly planned, the French second-line squadrons advanced to try to overrun the Allied foot soldiers. The consistency of the men in the column and the massed bayonets the French cavalry exhibited probably had as much influence on the repulsion as the severity of the musketry generated. Cumberland rebuilt his army behind the town of Vaison despite losses to his force and challenging conditions of retiring from touch with an energetic, tired opponent. Much of the army's equipment was stolen when the United Army marched to At, a fortification. Maurice de Saxe, the marshal, was almost completely tired and could not try much more that day because of the covering force of Allied cavalry. Still, the Allied force was probably not in any better condition than their adversary. Both armies sustained great casualties on May 11, 1745. Cumberland, Koenigsegg, and Waldeck had 50,000 men, and their army's casualty count was around 7,300 dead, injured, or missing. With 5,700 dead or injured, the British and Hanoverian infantry suffered the most among the ranks. While burial parties toiled to take away the roughly 5,000 dead soldiers and hundreds of dead horses, the French medical teams and troops to recover the injured tried their best for their afflicted opponent. Allied triumph came tantalizingly near for a moment as Saxe's line bowed and shattered under Cumberland's onslaught. George II was partial to his son's behavior even if he blamed the left wing's actions for the attack's failure on the French lines at Tournai. Field Marshal Koenigsegg said the lack of success resulted from Waldeck's failure to drive home his offensive to good effect. The two forces fought their fight at Fontenoy using somewhat different strategies. While Cumberland battled to drive the French away from the fortification, defend the area, and give a strong blow, Saxe sought to drive the Allied force out, inflict damage, and then proceed with the siege of Tournai. Cumberland and his other commanders suffered disappointment and consequences for their leaving from the field during the French siege of Tournai. Although accused of misbehavior during the Allied retreat, Captain Watts of the 2nd Regiment of Horse was cleared. To sweep the camp and chase out problematic French Grassins, Cumberland sent dragoon squadrons. While Cumberland traveled with the British and Hanoverians to Lessines on the River Dender, the Dutch marched to Liège to draw on supply stores. Saxe, who was under constant French bombardment on Tournai, was the driving force behind the campaign. Often disregarded in narratives of the Battle of Fontenoy is the garrison's commendable conduct in limiting Saxe's freedom for much longer than predicted. After Tournai surrendered, Saxe led his forces deep into friendly territory, north towards Ghent. Arriving before the town on July 11th, Count von Lowendahl's soldiers tore through the meager defenses of Ghent, Bruges, and Oudenarde. Only yielding early in October after a brave resistance, the Allied garrison in 88th resisted a siege carried out by Saxe personally. Frederick II drove an Austrian and Saxon army from Hohenfriedberg in Silesia, and then the Prussians proceeded into Bohemia. Arriving in Scotland in 1745, Prince Charles Edward Stuart sought to expose George II's unlawful reign in London against a benchmark. News of the trip, meant to divert the British from their Low Country campaign, reached the Duke of Cumberland. Tasked with defending the north, French soldiers developed sympathy for the Stuart cause. General Sir John Cope advised that the Clan Campbell be rearmed and cautioned the government of mounting Highland discontent. But Cope was essentially pushed to one side, and the young pretender marched south via Dunkeld, Perth, and Stirling. Under covering, a Jacobite advance group entered the city, and the government soldiers were decisively routed. The Jacobites struggled in their battle against Charles Edward, who lacked funds and had little backing. Mirroring Cumberland's commands, the Duke of Atholl gave his Highlanders instructions to burn and destroy the homes and possessions of anybody who refused to join him. This resulted in army shortages and a fall in the power of the Jacobites. From Aberdeen, Cumberland marched north in search of a certain triumph in open combat. But the Jacobites passed the River Spy without incident, and by April, Cumberland's forward force were at Nairn. Charles Edward decided to focus his troops on Drumossie Moor close to Culloden House, but the action was called off when the leading column strayed close to Kilravach House. With 7,800 men, Cumberland pushed from Nairn. Charles Edward's force was reduced to only 5,000. Over who ought to occupy the place of honor on the right of the line, the Jacobite leaders started fighting. Unable to breach the government line in notable numbers, the Jacobite army was routed in disarray and anarchy. Maria Theresa's husband, Archduke Francis Stephen, was chosen emperor in September 1745 by the Treaty of Fusen. But the French-Dutch conflict persisted, with the Low Countries' summer campaign devoid of action and mostly concentrated on sieges of significant fortifications. By August, the French captured Antwerp, Valenciennes, and Mons. The emphasis then turned to the arsenal the Allies had at Namur. On the Rhine, Prince Charles of Lorraine amassed a strong Austrian army. Yet, their supply lines were depleted, and the Marshal had to contend with individuals being assigned commands. With Louis XV's ministers suggesting restoration to the proper owners of all strongholds and estates seized during the conflict, the French-Dutch war was almost at a negotiated end. The British were less enticing, however, and Parliament in London authorized bigger subsidies to support Maria Theresa and her troops. William IV, Prince of Orange, led the States General in revitalizing their military effort. The Duke of Cumberland trained and equipped Dutchmen for the 1747 campaign. After a last coup in the spring of 1748, Saxe, feinting towards Breda and Tilburg, rapidly marched his main force to invest Maastricht. Agreed upon on May 4, 1748, peace arrangements settled over Western Europe with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. But once again, fresh strife emerged, with Austria and Prussia serving as the main enemy. Mixed fortunes were experienced in 1761, with successes for the British in Pondicherry and India, and the French at Vellinghausen in Westphalia. After 8 years of war, countless battles and shifting alliances, the War of the Austrian Succession ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Maria Theresa retained her throne, but at great cost, while Prussia emerged as a rising power with its grip on Silesia. Though the war resolved some disputes, it left many tensions simmering, setting the stage for future conflicts, including the 7 Years' War. In the end, this was not just a war over succession but a battle for dominance in Europe and beyond. The balance of power had shifted, and history would never be the same.